They kicked my husband and me out of a snowy cabin on Christmas night, laughing as they locked the door behind us, never imagining the sheriff would arrive and expose who really owned the place. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I'm Rachel Miller, and that night is burned into my memory. Daniel and I had driven for hours through the mountains of Colorado, watching the road disappear under fresh snow. The cabin lights looked warm from a distance, and for a moment everything felt right. We were tired but happy. Christmas music played softly in the car, and Daniel squeezed my hand as we stepped inside, believing this would be a quiet holiday away from noise and stress. The cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke. I started unpacking groceries, already thinking about dinner, when the front door opened hard behind us. Cold air rushed in. Daniel froze. Standing there were his older brother, Mark Bennett, and Mark's wife, Linda. They didn't greet us. They didn't smile. Mark looked around like an inspector, not a guest, while Linda crossed her arms and scanned the room as if we didn't belong. Mark spoke first. His voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He said we needed to leave. He said this cabin was his. I laughed at first, thinking it was a bad joke. Daniel tried to explain, keeping his voice steady, but Mark cut him off. Linda stepped closer, her face tight with something that felt like long-held anger. She said Christmas or not, we were not welcome. The air changed. The warmth drained from the room. Snow tapped against the windows, and the fire suddenly felt small. Mark's words grew louder. He said papers had changed. He said we had no right to be there. I watched Daniel's face, the way his jaw tightened, the way old pain seemed to rise in him. This wasn't just about a cabin. This was something deeper. We tried to reason with them, but there was no room for that. Mark opened the door and stood aside, pointing outside. Linda tossed our coats toward us like we were strangers. When Daniel hesitated, Mark laughed. It was a short, cruel sound. He said we should be grateful he wasn't calling the police. We stepped into the snow, stunned. The door slammed shut behind us. The lock clicked. Through the window, I saw Linda draw the curtains. Their laughter followed us into the night. The cold hit fast, sharp and unforgiving. Christmas lights inside glowed while we stood outside, shaking. I looked at Daniel, and in that moment, I felt the betrayal fully settle in. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And as the snow kept falling, I knew this night was far from over. This didn't start that night. What happened in the snow was only the final step of something that had been building for years. From the first day I met Mark and Linda, I could feel it. The smiles never reached their eyes, and every compliment came with a sharp edge hidden inside. Mark was the kind of man who liked to remind everyone where he stood. He ran the family business after their father passed, and he wore that role like a badge of honor. Daniel was different. He chose a quieter life, steady work, no need to impress anyone. Mark never forgave him for that. At every family gathering, Mark found a way to point it out. He would talk about profits, expansions, and connections, then pause and ask Daniel what he was doing these days, as if his life was a small hobby. Linda followed his lead. She laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. She commented on my clothes, asking where I bought them in a tone that made it clear she thought she knew better stores. When I cooked, she tasted the food and added salt without trying to hide it. None of it was loud enough to start a fight, but it was constant, like small cuts you're expected to ignore. Daniel tried to brush it off. He always said keeping peace was easier than arguing. But I could see how it weighed on him. Around Mark, he spoke less. His shoulders pulled in, like he was bracing for something. Every holiday came with the same tension, and Christmas was always the worst. That evening, before everything fell apart, we had all sat around the table. The tree lights were on, and plates were passed, but the room felt stiff. Mark talked about money again. He joked about carrying the family name and said not everyone was built for responsibility. Linda nodded and added comments about how hard it was to maintain a certain lifestyle. Then she looked straight at me and smiled thinly. I tried to change the subject, but it didn't help. The words kept landing where they were meant to land. Daniel went quiet, pushing food around his plate. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Something about that dinner felt off, heavier than usual. The holiday warmth everyone talks about was missing. It felt staged, like we were actors invited only to make someone else look bigger. I remember looking around the cabin and realizing no one was truly happy. There was no laughter, no comfort, just control. Mark wasn't interested in sharing the space. He wanted ownership of the moment, of the place, and of Daniel. And Linda watched it all with approval. By the time the plates were cleared, I knew this wasn't going to end like other holidays. The tension hadn't eased. It had sharpened. And somewhere deep inside, I understood that whatever Mark had planned, it was meant to remind us exactly where he believed we belonged. After dinner, Mark stood up and said we needed to talk. His tone was firm, like a boss calling a meeting. He didn't ask us to sit. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted control of the room. Linda stayed close to him, her arms folded, her lips pressed into a knowing smile. Mark said the cabin was no longer available to us. He said things had changed and that he was the rightful owner now. Daniel looked confused but stayed calm. He asked what Mark meant. That's when Mark said their uncle had changed the paperwork before he passed. He said it casually, as if it were a small detail that didn't need proof. Linda nodded quickly and said it was all handled legally. She spoke with confidence, like someone who had practiced the line before. She said we should have been informed already and acted surprised that we were still here. Her eyes never left me. There was no doubt in her voice, no hesitation. Daniel explained that we had been given the keys and were told to use the cabin for the holidays. He said there must be some mistake. He spoke slowly, trying to keep things respectful. Mark didn't let him finish. He stepped closer and said the keys didn't matter anymore. He said invitations could be taken back. The room felt smaller. Mark's voice grew harder. He said if we didn't leave on our own, he would call the authorities and report us for trespassing. The word hit me like ice. Trespassing. On Christmas. Linda smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. She said it would be embarrassing for us if things went that far. I watched Daniel carefully. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply asked to see the paperwork Mark claimed existed. That's when Mark snapped. He said Daniel didn't deserve explanations. He said ownership was ownership, and we had no place questioning it. His face flushed, and I could see how badly he wanted us to feel small. That was the moment I understood this wasn't confusion. It wasn't a family mix-up. This was planned. They wanted us uncomfortable. They wanted us doubting ourselves. Mark wasn't trying to prove anything, he was trying to dominate the situation. Linda stood there like a witness who already knew the ending. I felt anger rise, but also clarity. Nothing we said would change their behavior. Mark had already decided how this night would go. He wanted us gone, and he wanted us to leave feeling ashamed. The cabin, the paperwork, the threats, they were tools. What mattered to him was power. As Mark pointed toward the door, I realized this wasn't about property at all. It was about reminding Daniel of his place, or at least the place Mark believed he belonged. And as the tension thickened in the room, I knew that whatever came next would reveal just how far they were willing to go to make their point. Mark didn't give us time to think. He opened the front door wide, letting the cold rush in, and told us to leave now. His voice was flat, like this was a simple task he wanted finished. Linda grabbed our coats from the hooks and tossed them toward us without care. One landed in the snow. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look away. The wind hit my face the moment I stepped outside. Snow was falling fast, thick and heavy, covering the ground and our footprints almost immediately. Daniel followed me out slowly, still trying to process what was happening. Before either of us could turn back, the door slammed shut. A sharp click followed. The lock. For a second, I just stood there, staring at the wooden door in front of me, unsure if this was real. Warm light spilled through the windows, and I could see shadows moving inside. Then the curtains were pulled closed. The cabin went silent. The cold settled in quickly. It crawled through my clothes and into my bones. I pulled my coat tighter, my hands already numb. Snow gathered in my hair. Christmas night had never felt so empty. This wasn't a stranger doing this to us. This was family. That thought hurt more than the freezing air. Daniel paced for a moment, rubbing his hands together. His face was tight, eyes dark with anger and something worse, hurt. He had trusted them. I could see him fighting the urge to pound on the door, to demand answers. Instead, he stopped, took a deep breath, and looked away. The silence between us was heavy. We walked to the car without speaking. Snow crunched under our feet, loud in the stillness. When we got inside, the heater took too long to warm up. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the shock. Daniel stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing holding him together. Minutes passed. The snow kept falling, covering the car, the road, everything. We were alone. No nearby cabins. No lights in the distance. Just us and the dark woods around us. I felt a mix of fear and disbelief. I never imagined a holiday could turn into this. I finally asked Daniel what we should do. He didn't answer right away. He was torn. I could see it in his eyes. Part of him wanted to leave and never look back. Another part couldn't accept being pushed out like this, not without understanding why. We sat there, listening to the wind, trying to decide our next move. Christmas music still played softly on the radio, out of place and almost cruel. And as the snow continued to fall, I knew this night was forcing us to choose between walking away in silence or standing up for ourselves, no matter the cost. We sat in the car with the engine running, the heater slowly pushing out warm air. My fingers started to thaw, but my chest still felt tight. I could tell Daniel was holding something back. He kept opening his mouth like he wanted to speak, then closing it again. Finally, he let out a long breath and looked at me. He said there was something I needed to know. His voice was low, careful, like he was afraid saying it out loud would make it worse. I turned toward him and waited. Daniel told me about his uncle, Harold Bennett. Years ago, before his health declined, Harold had called Daniel to the cabin. No one else was there. Harold had told him he trusted him more than anyone in the family. He said Mark was too focused on control and appearances, and he didn't want the cabin used as a trophy or sold off. He wanted it to stay a place of peace. Daniel said Harold quietly transferred the cabin into his name. No big announcement. No family meeting. Just paperwork signed and filed. Harold asked Daniel to keep it private to avoid conflict while he was still alive. Daniel agreed. He said he never planned to use it as leverage or to prove anything. He just wanted to honor his uncle's wishes. I sat there in shock. I asked why he never told me. Daniel said he didn't want to create distance between me and his family. He hoped things would stay calm. He believed avoiding the topic would keep the peace. He never imagined it would be turned against us like this. I felt a mix of emotions, surprise, anger, and relief all at once. What Mark said inside the cabin suddenly made sense. The confidence. The lies. They were counting on Daniel staying silent. I told him this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about protecting himself and the truth. Daniel nodded slowly. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside were copies of the documents. The ink had faded slightly, but the names were clear. His name. The cabin. Everything official. He had kept them there all this time, just in case something ever went wrong. I held the papers in my hands and felt the weight of them. Not just legal weight, but emotional weight. Years of silence. Years of being treated as less. I looked at Daniel and told him this wasn't something to hide anymore. He didn't owe anyone his quietness. He stared at the papers for a long moment, then nodded. The hesitation in his face eased, replaced by something steadier. The fear was still there, but so was resolve. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the car, everything had shifted. Whatever happened next, we weren't powerless. We had the truth. And for the first time that night, I felt like we were no longer just reacting. We were ready to stand our ground. I took a slow breath and told Daniel I was going to make a call. Not to argue, not to threaten, just to get clarity. My hands were steady as I picked up my phone. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt focused. Whatever was happening needed to be handled the right way. When the sheriff's office answered, I explained the situation clearly. I said we were locked out of a cabin on Christmas night and that there were conflicting claims about who owned the property. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I simply said there might be false information being used and that we wanted to handle things peacefully. The person on the line listened and said an officer would come by to sort it out. I hung up and looked at Daniel. He nodded, saying nothing. We waited. Through the windshield, we could see movement inside the cabin. The curtains shifted. A light turned on, then off. Mark must have seen the patrol car lights in the distance because the door opened suddenly. He stepped onto the porch, his phone in his hand, pacing. The confidence he had earlier was gone. His movements were sharp and restless. Linda joined him, speaking quickly, her voice tight. She touched his arm, trying to calm him down. From where we sat, we couldn't hear the words, but we didn't need to. The tone was clear. This wasn't part of their plan. Mark shook his head, rubbing his forehead, then pointed toward the road like he was arguing with himself. A few minutes later, they both went back inside. The lights stayed on. The curtains didn't close this time. Mark kept checking his phone. Linda stood near the window, watching the driveway. The control they had felt earlier was slipping, and it showed in every movement. Inside the car, the silence was different now. Daniel's shoulders were no longer tense. He looked calm, almost relieved. The truth was no longer something we were holding alone. It was about to be placed in front of someone who had no history, no bias. As headlights appeared at the end of the road, my heart beat faster, but not from fear. It was from knowing the story was about to change. Mark had built his confidence on intimidation and lies. Now those walls were starting to crack. The snow reflected the flashing lights as the patrol car pulled closer. Mark stepped outside again, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Linda stayed behind him, quiet now. The balance had shifted. The night was no longer under their control. Sitting there, watching it unfold, I realized something important. Calm had more power than anger ever could. And in that moment, the truth was finally walking its way up the driveway. The sheriff stepped out of his vehicle and looked around the snowy driveway before walking toward us. He spoke calmly, asking what was going on. His presence alone changed the air. Everything felt slower, heavier. Mark went first. He walked forward like he owned the place, his shoulders straight, his voice loud and confident. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He claimed the cabin belonged to him and that we were refusing to leave. He pulled out a folder and handed the sheriff a few papers, explaining that the ownership had been updated before their uncle passed. He spoke smoothly, like someone used to being believed. Linda stood close beside him, nodding along, her face tight but composed. She didn't say much, but her silence felt practiced, like she knew exactly when to let Mark speak. The sheriff took the papers and looked them over without reacting. Then he turned to us. He asked if we had anything to add. I stepped forward and handed him the envelope Daniel had been holding. I explained that the cabin had been transferred years ago and that we had been locked out despite having the right to be there. I kept my voice even. There was no need to argue. The sheriff opened the envelope and pulled out the documents. He read them slowly, comparing names, dates, and signatures. He checked the transfer letter from Uncle Harold carefully, holding it up under the light from his vehicle. No one spoke. Snow continued to fall around us, thick and quiet. Mark shifted on his feet. His confident posture began to fade. He cleared his throat and tried to explain again, saying paperwork could be confusing and mistakes happened. The sheriff didn't respond. He kept reading. Linda's face lost its color. She stopped nodding. Her hands clasped together tightly in front of her. The silence stretched longer than I expected. It felt like the entire night was holding its breath. Finally, the sheriff looked up. He asked Mark a few direct questions about the documents he had provided. Mark stumbled over his answers. His words didn't line up the way they had before. The certainty in his voice cracked, just slightly at first, then more. Daniel stood beside me, calm and still. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was right there on paper, clear and unchanging. As the sheriff continued to review everything, Mark's arrogance drained away completely. He stopped trying to lead the conversation. He stopped meeting the sheriff's eyes. And in that quiet, snowy driveway, it became clear that the story Mark had built was falling apart, piece by piece. The sheriff folded the papers and looked up at all of us. His voice was calm but firm. He said the ownership was clear. The cabin legally belonged to Daniel Miller. There was no confusion, no overlap, and no missing information. The documents matched official records. The matter was settled. For a moment, no one moved. Mark stared at the ground like he hadn't heard correctly. Then he looked up and tried to speak, but the sheriff raised a hand and stopped him. He warned Mark about presenting false documents and about forcing people out of a property they legally owned. He explained that locking us out could be considered unlawful eviction. His words were measured, but the message was sharp. Linda's face twisted with anger. She took a step back, then another. Her composure broke. She started talking fast, saying this wasn't fair, that she had been told the cabin was theirs. Her voice rose, then cracked. Her anger turned into embarrassment right there in the snow. She crossed her arms tightly, staring at the cabin as if it had betrayed her. The sheriff turned toward the cabin and told them they needed to gather their belongings and leave immediately. He said there would be no further discussion. Mark nodded stiffly, his face pale. The confidence he had carried all night was gone. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He just walked back toward the door. Linda followed, muttering under her breath. The door opened, and warm light spilled out again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't welcoming. It was something they were losing. Daniel and I stood together, watching. Mark and Linda moved quickly now, pulling bags from closets, stuffing clothes without folding them. They bumped into each other in the small space, frustration written on every movement. Nothing was said to us. They didn't look our way. When they stepped outside with their bags, the snow had covered their footprints just like ours earlier. The sheriff watched as they loaded their car. Linda slammed the trunk shut harder than needed. Mark got into the driver's seat without a word. As their car drove away, the driveway fell silent again. The humiliation they had tried to place on us had turned back on them. I didn't feel joy. I felt calm. Justice had been quiet, but it had arrived. I looked at Daniel, standing tall beside me, and for the first time that night, the cold no longer mattered. When the sheriff left and the road went quiet again, Daniel and I stood there for a moment without speaking. Snow continued to fall, soft and steady, as if the night itself was settling down. Then we walked back toward the cabin together. Daniel unlocked the door and held it open for me. The warmth hit us immediately. The fire was still burning in the fireplace, steady and calm. The Christmas lights glowed softly along the walls, untouched. Everything looked the same as before, yet it felt completely different. The tension that had filled the space was gone. We stepped inside and closed the door behind us. Daniel locked it, slow and deliberate. The sound of the lock clicking felt final, but not angry. It was quiet, controlled. It was his decision, made on his own terms. Neither of us said much. There was no need. We took off our coats and placed them neatly on the chairs. I walked to the fireplace and held my hands out toward the heat, feeling it sink into my skin. The cold of the night slowly faded away. Daniel moved around the cabin, straightening things that didn't need fixing. It wasn't nervous energy. It felt more like grounding himself, reclaiming the space. He paused by the window, then gently pulled the curtains closed, shutting out the snow and the empty driveway beyond. I sat down on the couch and let the silence wrap around me. It wasn't heavy or awkward. It was peaceful. The kind of silence that comes after something difficult finally ends. No voices. No pressure. Just breathing and warmth. There was no satisfaction in imagining Mark and Linda driving away. No desire to replay the moment. What mattered was what we had now. The cabin felt safe again. Not because of locks or papers, but because the truth had been honored. Daniel joined me and sat quietly. He didn't talk about revenge. He didn't talk about family. He simply sat there, his presence steady and calm. I rested my head against his shoulder, and for the first time all night, I felt like we could breathe. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the road, smoothing everything out. Whatever bitterness had been brought into that cabin was gone. What remained was dignity, peace, and the quiet strength of knowing we didn't have to fight loudly to win. The night finally belonged to us again. Sitting by the fire, I let myself think about everything that had happened. The night had started with hope, then turned into betrayal, fear, and cold. Yet now, with the cabin quiet and the snow falling outside, I could finally see the lessons hidden in it all. I realized that family doesn't automatically mean kindness or respect. Just because someone shares your blood doesn't mean they will honor you. Mark and Linda had tried to humiliate us, but that didn't make them right. I understood that boundaries are not optional, they are necessary. Standing firm, even when it's hard, doesn't make you mean or unloving. It makes you strong. Daniel and I talked quietly about what had happened, not in anger, but in understanding. He said he had avoided conflict for years, trying to keep peace. I told him that peace isn't the absence of struggle, peace is knowing your worth and protecting it. That night, justice had come to us, but quietly, without shouting or revenge. It came through patience, truth, and doing the right thing. I thought about the way Mark had laughed at our shock, how he had tried to control everything. And I realized that strength isn't proving someone else wrong. Strength is knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone erase that. That was the real victory that Christmas. Not gloating, not punishment, it was reclaiming our dignity and our life. Looking around the cabin, I felt warmth beyond the fire. It was a different kind of warmth, the kind that comes from safety, clarity, and knowing you are valued. The decorations, the lights, and even the snow outside felt gentle now, as if the world itself was reminding us that hope and peace can return, even after cruelty. That Christmas taught me that life isn't about controlling others or showing them who's right. It's about standing firm when they try to make you feel small. It's about patience when justice is slow and quiet. It's about valuing yourself enough not to let anyone rewrite your story. Daniel and I held hands by the window, watching the snow cover the driveway. I thought about Mark and Linda, driving away, angry and embarrassed. And I felt no hatred, only relief and understanding. We had learned something bigger than anger or revenge. We had learned strength, patience, and self-respect. That night, I understood the real meaning of Christmas. It wasn't about gifts or celebrations. It was about peace, safety, and standing strong when life tests you. The warmth in the cabin wasn't just from the fire, it was the quiet, steady glow of dignity, love, and resilience. And I knew that no one, not even family, could take that away.